This is part 3 of Anselm's ontological argument. We've just been looking at Gaunilo's criticisms of Anselm, and now we're going to see Anselm's response as well as look at his second version of the ontological argument. Gaunilo argues that to rescue his argument, Anselm would need to adequately demonstrate that the concept of God is different from all other concepts, so that unlike other concepts, it could not be doubted to exist, that God is of such a character that it cannot be held in concept only. Anselm and others argue that God is a special case. The ontological argument can only be applied to God, not to islands, since only God uniquely satisfies that than which nothing greater can be conceived. In his book of defence against Gaunilo in 1078, Anselm argues that only God satisfies this definition, due to God uniquely possessing the attribute of necessary existence. Everything else has contingent existence. Islands, for example, are contingent on water. The property of existing necessarily can only be applied to God. He says, God cannot be conceived not to exist. Whatever else there is, except God alone, can be conceived not to exist. God cannot be thought not to be. Otherwise, God could be conceived to have a beginning and an end, and so a mind could conceive of a being greater than that than which nothing greater can be thought, which is a contradiction. This relates very closely to his second version of the ontological argument in the Proslogion, chapter 3, where he states, God, again, is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Secondly, it is greater to exist necessarily rather than contingently. Contingent things depend on something else for their existence, meaning they may or may not exist at any point in time, depending. Something that is not contingent exists necessarily, meaning it is not dependent on anything else for its existence. It must always have existed and couldn't not exist. Thus, God exists necessarily. Otherwise, God could not be the greatest conceivable being, as a greater being could be conceived, i.e. one that exists necessarily and not contingently. And this, Anselm says, is most absurd, due to the definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This argument is supported by Alvan Plantinga, who argues in God, Freedom and Evil, 1974, that only God satisfies the definition, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And the reason for this is that God uniquely possesses the attribute of intrinsic maximum, meaning he is unable to be made greater. If you can make something greater, it is not the greatest, and only God cannot be made greater. Islands and other things can be made greater, and so the argument does not apply to them. The idea of an island than which nothing greater can be conceived is therefore incoherent, because an island can always be bettered. In other words, islands have no intrinsic maximum. Only God can be the greatest conceivable thing, not an island or any other example. All of these things can be made greater, unlike God, who by definition cannot be greater. The property of intrinsic maximum can only be applied to God. This video has been brought to you by Jest.